All right, welcome back to another objects video. Today we're going to talk about API, or Application Program Interfaces. This is the documentation that you'll see for classes that allow you to know how to create objects. And so to start with, I'm going to use the player class I created and show you what the documentation may look like for it. And then we'll flip back to how would that help us when we are creating objects and using objects from this class. So on the right side of my screen here is the type of documentation you'll probably find. This is generally what APIs look like. Maybe not quite this exact format, but pretty close. And so typically, in addition to what I've listed here, most classes will also kind of give some examples of usage. So it's really helpful. And actually, before I dive into this too deeply, I want to show you that for any class that's in the Java library, like Scanner, for example, you can do Java API and then the class, Scanner. And Google will pretty quickly and easily find it in Oracle. And so if you click on it, this is really what an API looks like for a much more complicated class than my player class. And so there's a couple of details here about the class. We'll learn a lot more about what these things mean, like extends and implements, as we go through the rest of this course. But it shows you examples about how to use it, how do you create a scanner to read an integer, how do you read from a file, some other examples of what you can do with scanners. Because it's a complicated class, there's a lot of information about how you can do this. But if you scroll down enough, you'll see a constructor summary. Now, my player class has one constructor, but classes can have several, and the scanner class has several. In fact, it looks like about 10. And so these are all different ways to create scanner objects. You can scan from a file, you can scan from an input stream, a path, a readable. Input stream is like system.in, which is the keyboard. But there's plenty of ways to read information in, and so this is a list of all the different constructors and different types of information you can give them. And then there's a list of all the methods. So you can close a scanner, you can delimiter a scanner, you can find in line, you can do a bunch of stuff. Um, we mostly, in the past, I'm sure you mostly have used a very small selection of these. Maybe you've used next to read in a next line. Or next word. Maybe use next double to read in a double, or next int to read in an int. They're all here. And so while this is a much more complex and lengthy and has a lot more information than the one I've given you on the left here, I wanted to highlight that if as we do this more and more and we use more and more classes, you'll get better at diving down into the pieces of these APIs that you need. I'm going to start by giving you some APIs where you don't have to dive in. All the information you need is up front. But it's important that we see these and use these. And I want to kind of translate real quickly, for example, my constructor. In this constructors section, we have the player constructor. You'll note that in the actual class, I wrote it so that it takes in a string input name, an int input height, and a double input apples. If I change this constructor, for example, made one that just reads in a name, I could do that, but myself, as the creative class, would then be responsible for updating my documentation to show that the new constructor is also available. And so I may use that in future videos, but for now we're going to read in all three pieces of information. And so it's important to note that this API, this documentation, is really a summary of what is written in the class, and it kind of hides it a little bit and just shows you what you need to know. So it's quicker access. Rather than opening up all the source code and figuring this stuff out, it's summarized here in the API. So APIs are your friend. You should get to like them and use them and love them. You'll note that this is the getName method. The getName method returns a string. That is, it gives back to the program that calls the method. If you make a player object, you call the getName method, you're going to receive or get returned to you a string, which is the name of the player. So this summarizes the key pieces of information. The getName is the name of the method. It requires no inputs. There's nothing in parentheses, and it returns a string, and it gives back a string, which is the name of the player. So that's the idea of the API. It highlights the important information. Lets you know how you can set the player's height or get the player's height, set the number of apples, eat apples, throw apples, and oh, this and as a quick note, I wrote this and I had a typo. This should be get num apples. Um, so be careful about that. But mostly the documentation people give you is well vetted. If it's not correct, then people will let them know and they'll correct it. So getting height, getting number of apples, eating apples. The last thing I wanted to highlight here before I move on is that void. If you see void listed as a return type, that means the method does not return anything. When I talked in the last video about mutators and accessors, accessors get information from the class, mutators change the class. A general rule of thumb, that's not always true, but mostly true, is that if a method is void, then it is a mutator. If a method doesn't return any information, then it's not accessing information in the class, so therefore we can assume that it's actually changing information in the class. So in this case, we have a void method called eatApples. That means it's a mutator, and it's changing the number of apples that the player has. ThrowApple also void. And so what this translates to in your code is mutators, like eatApples and ThrowApple, void methods, will not be in print statements and will not be assigned to a variable. But methods that do return things, like getName, getHeight, and getNumApples, they return data, and this data should be either printed or stored in a variable because we're accessing information and we need to do something with that information once we get it. So hopefully this API is helpful. The key here is that the documentation shows you all the ways that you can create a new player and all the things you can do with a player once you create it. And this is really core and critical to classes and objects and sharing code between different programmers. Writing good documentation is key here. There's some questionable choices I made in defining my class. There's some ways I could have written it better to make the player do something more useful, but even though it's not a perfect player, and maybe it's not even perfect for my game, it could save you a lot of programming work. And so sometimes, even if things aren't quite the way you want them to be, finding something similar to what you want that someone else has written can be a really good starting point for you. And reading this documentation can be really helpful. So hopefully the value of this documentation is clear to you. I will be giving you a lot of APIs as we go through the course of the semester for various classes. And you should generally be able to create an object and call methods on the object just by reading the API for that object. So hopefully that all makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to all of you pretty soon.